Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see all of you. I wanted to begin with a question. Most of you are American. Who do you consider to be the greatest Americans? And I'm sure you'll all have different answers. Some people will say George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, Marie Curie, Steve Jobs, some famous Hollywood celebrities, who knows? T.S. Eliot, my favorite poet. Anyway, many different answers to that question. But notice what they all have in common, just these examples I threw out, but you can come up with your own. Most Americans tend to define greatness in terms of external achievements. Something visible, something flashy that other people can see and recognize that makes them world famous. And those are great. There is a certain greatness in that. But I want to make the case today that a humble American lady who passed away quietly in Indiana in 1981 was one of the greatest people America has ever produced. And this was a greatness that was not primarily external, it was primarily internal. It was an internal spiritual greatness. And I think that America needs to learn, one of the things it can learn from India is to appreciate and value more internal greatness as opposed to just external greatness. And it's telling that she's still virtually unknown. How many of you have heard of Pilgrim? There are a few people in the audience, yeah. So today, I want to make her more widely known in my own humble way, because I think her teachings, her life are incredibly inspiring, incredibly important and urgent, especially in contemporary times. And I'll talk about why I think that is. And it's not a coincidence that I first heard about the Peace Pilgrim, not in the US, but in India. Right after my PhD, I moved to India, and then I joined in our monastic order in Pilgrim. And every novitiate needs to go through a 2-year training center. And in that training center, one of my acharyas, one of my teachers, was a senior Swami. He's now the head of one of our Bangalore centers, Swami Nityasanandaji. And he was the one who privately told me, he said, you should read this book, Peace Pilgrim. It's in our library, you should read it. And I read it. But it's telling, right, that it was an Indian monk during my time in India that said, you need to read about the life and teachings of this great American saint. It wasn't from anyone here. There are at least 4 reasons why I think that it's urgent for us to learn about and study, and more importantly, to internalize and practice the life and teachings of Peace Pilgrim. First, her saintly life can inspire us to engage in spiritual practice more earnestly, more sincerely, more fervently, because that's what her life was all about. And I hope to give you a taste of some of her incredibly practical teachings. It can't be an exhaustive discussion, but if my talk is successful, a number of you will run out to order this book called Peace Pilgrim, The Life or Her Life and Work in Her Own Words. It's cheap. You get it from Amazon. It's amazing. It's a really amazing spiritual treasure and handbook. So that's the first reason, but there are 3 other reasons at least. There are striking parallels between what she teaches and what she embodied in her life and Vedanta. And what's striking is that she didn't study Vedanta before she took to the spiritual path. She came to it on her own. She came to these insights on her own. So in a certain sense, she kind of reverse engineered Vedanta, which is very powerful for all of us who are drawn to Vedanta. And when we find this American woman who didn't read a single word of Vedanta or wasn't taught about Vedanta, never met any Vedantan monks, but literally just experienced through her own sincere spiritual practice the truths of Vedanta that were taught thousands of years ago in the Vedantic scriptures. So I think that's also powerful. Third reason, she had no human guru. In this age of YouTube gurus, all you need is a YouTube channel, internet access, and you can be the next guru. Actually, that should be a TV show, like America's Next Model and America's Next whatever, The Voice and whatever. It's America's Next Guru. There should be auditions. That's the age we live in now. She had no guru. What did Sri Ramakrishna used to say? When people would come to him, this is in late 19th century, they would come to Sri Ramakrishna and say, I'm trying hard and I'm trying to find a guru, but I can't find it. You know what he would say? He would say, Satchit Ananda is the guru, the true guru. Your own divine nature is the true guru. The divine within you will guide you from within, if you can only be receptive. And that's, her whole life embodies that and shows that. And finally, last but not least, the keynote of her teachings is bhakti, bhakti, bhakti. It's a Sanskrit term for devotion, simple devotion toward God, surrender to God, sincere prayer, heartfelt prayer to God. And that love needs to issue in universal love for all beings. It's not enough to just theoretically love God. If you really love God, it's going to spontaneously manifest in love for everybody. And that's what her life was all about. In my opinion, one of the greatest vices of our current age is a certain kind of intellectual top-heaviness, especially in the West, but now because of globalization, it's really pervasive, it's global. Since the Enlightenment, we've kind of ended up overvaluing reason at the expense of heart. And one way of thinking about our spiritual journey is that it's a journey from head to heart. Bhagavad Gita talks about spiritual practice in exactly this way. It says that in spiritual practice, we should try to stop the mind in the heart. Mano riddhi niruddhyacha is the Sanskrit phrase. Stop the mind in the heart. And we're all so top-heavy, we're just thinking all the time. One of the greatest maladies is there's a sickness of thought. Eckhart Tolle calls it the voice in our heads. It's just this endless chatter. And so, not surprisingly, the most glamorous spiritual practices are all mostly intellectual. The Neo-Advaitic practice, mindfulness practice, all of these are kind of intellectual. And they can help, I'm not saying that they're not useful, but they need to be leavened with the sweetness of bhakti. They need to be combined with the syrup and joy of heart practices. And she was all about heart practices. So this book, it's not like an autobiography. The really great ones don't write autobiographies. I don't want to generalize, but anyway, she didn't write one. Okay. So what we have is an extraordinarily brief account of her life because she never liked to talk about herself. Again, something characteristic of saints. They don't like to talk about themselves. And so we don't know much. And her teachings are basically tape recordings of conversations she had with people that would visit her, talk to her, little speeches she gave in different places. But let me tell you the little I can about her external life, and then we're going to go take a deep dive into her internal life as best we can and try to learn from it. I'm proud to say she was born in Boston, as I was, and raised in Boston, in the first decade of the 20th century, birth year unknown, and she liked to keep it that way. Her family was not religious in any way. But in high school, she just had this spontaneous spiritual calling, urge. And she just went from one person to another and said, what is God? What is God? What does this remind us of? Swami Vivekananda, the young Swami Vivekananda, Naren, who in Kolkata suddenly was gripped with this desire to realize God. And he kept going from one person to another in Kolkata asking, have you seen God? Have you seen God? So it's similar. And she was just different. She was just different. You know, everybody in high school is doing drugs and in relationships and smoking cigarettes and this and that. She never cared for any of it. She never did any of it. Something within her said, don't do it. And I want to read to you, just to give you a taste of her mindset, the way she speaks. It's all very inspiring. She says, I know I was being prepared for the pilgrimage when I made certain choices. She ultimately turns out to be a pilgrim. I'll talk about that in a second. For instance, I was in grammar school when I was offered cigarettes from a package, which I did not smoke, but my friends did. In high school, I was offered all kinds of alcohol, which I did not drink, but my friends did. Then just after my student days, I was faced with a kind of test, because all of my friends at that time used both alcohol and tobacco. There was such a push toward conformity in those days. They call it peer pressure now, that they actually looked down on me because I didn't do these things. And gathered in someone's living room, I said to them, just imagine this very young woman, she says, look, life is a series of choices, and nobody can stop you from making your choices. But I have a right to make my own choices, too. And I have chosen freedom. And I have chosen freedom. I love that. You'll find one of the keynotes of her teachings is freedom in her life, is freedom. What does freedom really mean? We celebrate Independence Day here, July 4th. That's great. It's a wonderful thing. It's an external form of freedom, which is that we're free from British rule. America's independent from the British, whatever. There's a deeper and greater and higher kind of freedom, which is an internal freedom. Freedom from anything external. We don't need anything outside of us to make us happy, to make us feel fulfilled. That was just something innate in her. That was a deep intuition. The moment I do any of these things, whatever it was, smoking or drinking or you lose a little bit of that freedom. There's one thing in life that you need that you don't have within yourself that you need in order to be happy. And she said, I don't want that. I want to be perfectly free. And she remained that way her entire life. It's incredible. While walking through the woods one day, she says, when she's still very young, she said, I felt a complete willingness without any reservations to give my life, to dedicate my life to service. Please use me, I prayed to God, and a great peace came over me. She felt an inner calling to work for peace throughout the world, and then she called herself Peace Pilgrim. But this isn't just outer peace. She wasn't just an ordinary peace activist. There's nothing wrong with that kind of peace activism, but she was much deeper, much more profound, much more spiritual. What she understood is that you cannot have external peace. You cannot have peace in the world. You cannot have nonviolence until you have perfect inner peace. And so she was really addressing the root of all of our problems and violence and lack of peace. The root is we're not peaceful within ourselves. And until we have that, there will never be peace in this world. She did 15 years of intense spiritual practice in order to realize God and in order to completely be able to surrender herself, mind, body, and soul to the divine. And her main practice was what Vedantins call nishkama karma, selfless service. She would serve the handicapped, the otherwise able, the mentally ill, and so on, people with drug addictions and other problems. And her inner practice was, she described it as an intense fight or struggle with her lower nature, what she also called her self-centered nature. So I hope you can already start seeing the parallels with Vedanta here. And again, spontaneously, without anybody guiding her, she just knew that in order to completely conquer her lower nature, she had to renounce. She had to renounce certain things, and we'll get to that in a second. And she had to simplify her life. So her whole life underwent a certain series of simplifications. She calls them simplifications. She was a lifelong celibate. She practiced chastity throughout her life. She was a vegetarian. And in January 1st, 1953, she began her pilgrimage, what she called her pilgrimage. What does she do? The picture here on the cover is of her with a tunic, a blue tunic, and the words Peace Pilgrim on it. And there are a bunch of, you can't see these, but there are a bunch of pockets at the bottom of her tunic. Literally, all of her worldly possessions were kept in those pockets in her tunic. She owned nothing apart from what she kept in those pockets, and she just walked all over the country. No home, no car, no friends. Everybody was a friend, but in that sense, no family in that sense. Where did she sleep? Where did she live? If there was a house nearby and she asked the people and they said, you can stay in our guest room, she stayed in the guest room. If they said, sorry, we can't let you stay, she would sleep under a tree. She was a wandering sannyasini. That's the Indian term for this. And in India, it's very common. You go to places in the Himalayas and other places, Narmada, and you'll find these wandering monks. There's a great traditions of thousands of years in India of wandering renunciates. So she was one of these extraordinary cases of an American woman. And it's much more dangerous for a woman. It's more difficult in so many ways. There's so many perils. But she did. And in a country that has absolutely no respect for these kinds of things. I mean, just in general, there's some people who might respect that. But as an ideal, that's, it's kind of frowned upon. They just think they'll call you homeless. Which she was. She was happily homeless. So she's a kind of a spiritual renegade in the US. Out of key with her time. That's a phrase I like from an Ezra Pound poem. Out of key with her time. During her wanderings, she continued to engage in extreme austerities. One of them was, it's extraordinary, a 45-day fast. Don't try this at home. 45 days. No food. Not one morsel of food. She just drank distilled water for 45 days. And she was living with the doctor, she was staying with the doctor and he let her stay in the guest house. And because he's a doctor, he was doing studies on the effects of fasting. And she was perfectly fine mentally and physically. It's amazing. Again, as I said, don't try this, but you can do shorter fasts if you want. And throughout that fast and throughout her life, her constant prayer was, make me an instrument through which only truth can speak. Make me an instrument through which only truth can speak. It's also one of Sri Ramakrishna's favorite prayers. Make me a mere instrument in thy hands, O Lord. And her main spiritual practice, as she herself, she used these exact words, she said, was to pray without ceasing. It's a phrase from the Bible that Paul used. Pray without ceasing, ceaseless prayer. Who was God? Who was the divine to the Peace Pilgrim? She was not like a Christian in that sense, so she didn't think of God in the form of Allah or Christ or Krishna or this or that. I would say if we had to pin her down, and we don't need to, but just maybe to get our bearings a little bit, I think that her understanding of the divine was of the formless but personal God. Formless. Doesn't mean that she rejected forms, that wasn't what drew her. The formless but personal God, a loving, universal, all-pervading presence that permeates everything and everyone, and that dwells within the hearts of everyone. And through all these spiritual practices, she ultimately realized God. And she said this about her own state of realization. She said, to know God is to reflect love toward all people and all creations. To know God is to feel peace within, a calmness, a serenity, an unshakableness which enables you to face any situation. To know God is to be so filled with joy that it bubbles over and goes forth to bless the world. I have only one desire now, to do God's will for me. There's no conflict. When God guides me to walk a pilgrimage, I do it gladly. When God guides me to do other things, I do them just as gladly. If what I do brings criticism upon me, I take it with head unbowed. If what I do brings me praise, I pass it immediately along to God, for I am only the instrument through which God does the work. When God guides me to do something, I'm given strength, I'm given supply, I'm shown the way, I'm given the words to speak. Whether the path is easy or hard, I walk in the light of God's love and peace and joy, and I turn to God with psalms of thanksgiving and praise. This it is to know God. And knowing God is not reserved for the great ones. It is for little folks like you and me. God is always seeking you, every one of you. You can find God if you will only seek, by obeying divine laws, by loving people, by relinquishing self-will, attachments, negative thoughts, and feelings. And when you find God, it will be in the stillness. You will find God within. This is pure Vedanta. And in a single sentence, she says, my illusory self is dead. The real self controls the garment of clay and uses it for God's work. At the heart of all of her teachings is a fundamental distinction she draws between two kinds of self, a lower self and a higher self. She says, I was not far down the spiritual road when I became acquainted with what the psychologists refer to as ego, lower self, and conscience, higher self, which I call the lower self and the higher self, or the self-centered nature and the God-centered nature. It's as though we have two selves or natures or two wills with two contrary viewpoints. Your lower self sees things from the viewpoint of your physical well-being only. Your higher self considers your psychological or spiritual well-being. Your lower self sees you as a center of the universe. Your higher self sees you as a cell in the body of humanity. When you are governed by your lower self, you are selfish and materialistic. But insofar as you follow the promptings of your higher self, you will see things realistically and find harmony within yourself and others. The body, mind, and emotions are instruments which can be used by either the self-centered nature or the God-centered nature. The self-centered nature uses these instruments, yet it is never fully able to control them, so there is a constant struggle. They can only be fully controlled by the God-centered nature. When the God-centered nature takes over, you have found inner peace. Until that time comes, a partial control can be gained through discipline. So the parallels with Vedanta here are quite striking. Sri Ramakrishna would often distinguish two kinds of self, which he would call in Bengali, Bodjatami, the rascal ego, or the rascal I, and Bhaktirami, the eye of a devotee. I talked about that at length in one of my previous talks here, which some of you probably attended, called Who Do We Become? Or, no, the title was something different, but that's the idea, is that try to identify with the Bhaktirami, the eye of a devotee, the eye of the child of God, as much as you can. And she's saying exactly the same thing. And notice also the language she's using here. She's saying that when you identify with this higher nature, this God-centered nature, it completely revolutionizes the way that you look upon your own physical body, the way you look at your mind, the way you look at your emotions and thoughts. They are instruments of the divine soul within. When you identify with the soul, it's not that you reject the body and the mind, you use them as vehicles, as instruments. This was taught in the Katha Upanishad thousands of years ago. This Upanishad uses a beautiful metaphor of a chariot. It says that the physical body, imagine that the physical body is like a chariot. The divine soul within you is like the rider in that chariot, the passenger. Imagine a king or a queen. The charioteer, the one holding the reins, buddhi, the higher intellect. The reins themselves, the mind. What's connected to the reins? Horses. The horses are the sense organs, the eyes, the ears. And the roads is this world of experience, sense objects. But notice that this metaphor in the Upanishads, it's not saying that the soul is completely transcendental, is totally aloof, a pure witness. It can control and govern the higher intellect, the buddhi, the charioteer, which will in turn control and govern the mind, the reins, the mental reins, which will in turn govern and control the horses, the sense organs. So this divine soul, if we can identify, the more we identify with this divine soul within us, that Atman, the better able we'll be able to use our body, our minds, our thoughts, our feelings as instruments to serve the divine. That's what she's saying. This should also remind us, if you're familiar with the Upanishads and Swami Vivekananda's teachings, Swami Vivekananda used to love to refer to a parable in the Mundaka Upanishad about two birds. There's a lower bird eating sometimes sweet fruits, sometimes bitter fruits. That's ordinary people, the lower self. And then sometimes it'll look up, glance up, high up in the tree. It sees this higher self, higher bird, completely blissed out, total equanimity. And that lower bird will look up and say, what does that higher bird have that I don't have? And then it'll slowly kind of like pop its way up a little closer to that higher bird until finally, and it's a spiritual journey, right? Until it realizes I was that higher bird all along. So that's exactly what Peace Pilgrim is also teaching. So what are we and how do we relate to the divine? She says, Peace Pilgrim says, there's a spark of good in everybody, no matter how deeply it may be buried. It is the real you. When I say you, what am I really thinking of? Am I thinking of the clay garment, the body? No, that's not the real you. Am I thinking of the self-centered nature? No, that's not the real you. The real you is that divine spark. Some call this the God-centered nature, others the divine nature and the kingdom of God within. The important thing to remember is that it dwells within you. So the whole purpose of spiritual practice, according to Peace Pilgrim, is to awaken our higher nature, our God-centered nature. And her teachings on spiritual practice are incredibly broad, incredibly universal. They can apply to anybody, no matter what religion you belong to, what country you belong to, what culture you belong to. She says, in the final analysis, you find spiritual truth through your own higher nature. Your higher nature is a drop in the ocean of God and has access to the ocean. Sometimes your higher nature is awakened through the inspiration of beautiful surroundings, like Trabuco, or beautiful music, bringing you insights of truth. Sometimes you see the truth written or hear the truth spoken, and your higher nature confirms it. Or you directly perceive the truth from the inside through an awakening of the higher nature, which is my way. All the inspired writing came from the inner source, and you too can receive from that source. Be still and know. So how do we realize this higher self? This is the big question. Well, there's no one-size-fits-all formula. That's also very Vedantic of her, not to say that you have to follow this rigid guideline. But she did outline 3 fundamental steps in spiritual life and spiritual practice that I think is helpful to just keep in mind. The 3 steps are preparations, purifications, and relinquishments. These are her words. Preparations, purifications, and relinquishments. So I'll take them all one at a time here. Preparations, 3 main preparations. First, she says, adopt a right attitude toward life. Try to be positive. Try not to get caught up in negativity. Even in the midst of tragedy, suffering, when things don't go your way, try to see all of those apparently negative things and circumstances as opportunities for spiritual practice. Try to take a spiritual attitude toward whatever you face in your day-to-day life. Second preparation, this is very profound and subtle. She says, you need to try to discover what she calls your special place in the life pattern. Capital L, capital P, life pattern. Discover your special place in the life pattern. She says, every one of us has a special place in the life pattern, and no 2 people have exactly the same part to play in God's plan. There is a guidance which comes from within to all who will listen. Through this guidance, each one will feel drawn to some part in the scheme of things. We must remain open to God's guidance. Then she says, when you come into this world, your jobs in the divine plan are there. There's a reason why we're here. We have a certain purpose. We have a certain calling, which we first need to discover within ourselves. They just need to be realized and lived. If you do not yet know where you fit, I suggest that you try seeking it in receptive silence. I used to walk amid the beauties of nature, just receptive and silent, and wonderful insights would come to me. You begin to do your part in the life pattern by doing all of the good things you feel motivated toward, even though they are just little good things at first. You give these priority in your life over all the superficial things that customarily clutter human lives. For any of you who know about Vedantic scriptures, this should remind you of the Bhagavad Gita's concept of swadharma, which Sri Aurobindo beautifully translates as our own law of being. And what Krishna tells us in the Gita is that we should try to, as spiritual aspirants, at the very beginning of spiritual life, we need to discover our own swadharma, discover our unique law of being. And on that basis, we need to engage in spiritual practices. So those are the 3, or that's a second preparation. I'll mention 2 preparations. For more, read the book. And the second step is, the third one is simplification of life. Sorry. So the third preparation is simplification of life. Simplify your life. And she said the best way to do that is to ask yourself, what are my wants and what are my needs? What do I really need? And what do I just want but not necessarily need? You have to run that kind of equation through everything you're doing in the course of your day, and then separate those 2 things. And she brought herself down to what she calls the need level, okay? And she became blissful. She had no wants because she did this drastic simplification of her life. And now, second step Okay, so I've explained the three preparations. Now, the second step are what she calls purifications. What kind of purifications? What needs to be purified? First of all, she says purification of the body through a vegetarian diet. Now, in our tradition, that's not mandatory, but she did it. She felt the calling to be vegetarian, mainly on ethical grounds, that it helps her to practice non-injury to all creatures. But more importantly, she says purification of thought. Purification of thought. This is far more important and far more difficult than purification of body. You can just shower to have a pure body, but how do you shower your mind? Through spiritual practices, through taking God's name, japa, mantra japa, and other things, prayer. Those are the ways to purify the mind. Bhagavad Gita calls that the highest austerity. The highest mental austerity is to keep the mind pure. Chandogya Upanishad, there's a mantra which says, Ahara Shuddhau Sattva Shuddhi. Ahara Shuddhau Sattva Shuddhi, which means through purification of ahara, which literally means food, you ultimately can purify the sattva, the mind. And then Sattva Shuddhau Dhruvasmritihi. With the pure mind, you can constantly remember your higher divine nature. This is the Chandogya Upanishad. Shankara beautifully interprets ahara here, not just as physical food, that's the lower meaning, but as anything that the sense organs take in. Anything in the world that we feel attracted to or that we get attached to is food, and you need to purify that. You need to purify your perceptions. You need to purify your experiences in the way that you engage in your day-to-day life. And if you do that, you end up purifying your mind. And then she says, we also need to purify. So we need to purify the body, we need to purify thoughts, and we need to purify desire. What does it mean to purify desire? The only desire we should have is to do God's will for us, to be perfect instruments of the divine. Which means we have to purify ourselves or purge ourselves of all selfish, self-centered desires. That's the spiritual practice. It's very difficult. And then she says, we also need to purify a fourth thing. Purify our motives when we act. Our motives for acting. She says we should have no selfish, no self-centered motives when we act. Our only motive should be to serve God and to serve other human beings. This is what Vedanta calls karma yoga. It's also taught in the Gita. What does it mean? Engage in your duties. What is your swadharma? Whatever your calling is in life. But there's a world of difference between doing your calling in a selfish spirit and doing it in a selfless spirit. If you can do your work to the best of your ability and then offer the fruits of your work to the divine, that becomes a very powerful spiritual practice and one that she often emphasizes. She then talks about, I should also mention, this is really interesting. She says in this book, I talk to groups studying the most advanced spiritual teachings, and sometimes these people wonder why nothing is happening in their lives. Their motive is the attainment of inner peace for themselves, which of course is a selfish motive. You will not find it with this motive. The motive, if you are to find inner peace, must be an outgoing motive. Service, of course, service. Giving, not getting. Your motive must be good if your work is to have good effect. The secret of life is being of service. This should remind any of us who are familiar with our literature of that wonderful incident toward the end of Ramakrishna's life when Naren, the future Swami Medhananda, came to him, his chief disciple, his best disciple, of the highest spiritual caliber, and comes to Sri Ramakrishna and says, please bless me so that I can remain in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, the highest state of samadhi, and I'll completely forget about this external world, good riddance, and just once in a while, I'll come down to just take a little milk to keep the body going, but I just want to remain blissed out in the state of samadhi. And Sri Ramakrishna gives him the scolding of a lifetime. Shame on you! I thought you would be like a great banyan tree, giving shade and shelter to thousands. Now I see you're selfish. You only care about your own salvation. It's exactly what Peace Pilgrim is saying. And then Ramakrishna says, aren't you the one who sings, O Lord, thou art all that exists? You see the divine in all beings. How can you ignore them? How can you turn a blind eye to them? Your mission in life is to serve other beings in a spirit of worship by seeing the divine in every single one of them. It's what Sri Ramakrishna used to call Shiva Jnane Jiva Seva. Serve others in a spirit of worship by trying to see the divine in everyone. This was exactly Peace Pilgrim's sadhana, her spiritual practice. And the third step, I'm going through them briefly, what she calls relinquishments. What is relinquishment? Renunciation. Good old renunciation. You can't do without it in spiritual life. What do you have to renounce? She says, relinquishment of self-will. Avoid doing anything that makes you more selfish and egoistic. It's very simple, actually. She says, you can work on subordinating the lower self by refraining from doing the not good things you may be motivated toward. Not suppressing them, but transforming them so that the higher self can take over your life. If you are motivated to do or say a mean thing, you can always think of a good thing. You deliberately turn around and use that same energy to do or say a good thing instead. It works. See how simple her teachings are and so charming. This is another cardinal teaching of Vedanta, is that instead of suppression, we should try to transform. We shouldn't try to suppress our lower desires, impulses, selfish impulses. Give them a Godward turn, as Ramakrishna used to say. And in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali calls this practice pratipaksha bhavanam, which means, let's say that you harbor this tremendous resentment toward another person. What do you do as a spiritual aspirant? You can't just say like, okay, I won't feel resentful anymore. No. You need to cultivate the opposite feeling. That's what pratipaksha bhavana means. Try to cultivate love for that very person you resent by trying to focus on that person's positive qualities, as an example. So this is what Peace Pilgrim is saying. Sublimate rather than suppress or repress. What else do we have to relinquish? The feeling of separateness, she says. Let's try to see ourselves and to see other people not as physical bodies, not as egos struggling, in a survival of the fittest, but as divine souls, as sparks of the divine fire. And then we become part of a grand family, a giant family. And we're all siblings. We're all sparks of that divine fire. What else do we relinquish? All attachments. And she uses a very Vedantic term herself. She says, no one is truly free who is still attached to material things or to places or to people. Material things must be put into their proper place. They're there for use. It's all right to use them. That's what they're there for. But when they've outlived their usefulness, be ready to relinquish them and perhaps pass them on to someone who does need them. Anything that you cannot relinquish when it has outlived its usefulness possesses you. And in this materialistic age, a great many of us are possessed by our possessions. It's a beautiful formulation. She says, we are not free. I considered myself liberated long before it became the fashion. So this is during the, liberation movements, women's lib and this and that. First, I liberated myself from debilitating habits and went on to free myself of combative, aggressive thoughts. I have also cast aside any unnecessary possessions. This, I feel, is true liberation, which is not to put down other forms of liberation, but the highest and the most important liberation is the inner spiritual liberation. She says, and now this is also really important for anybody who's in any kind of relationships with partners or children. She says, there's another kind of possessiveness. You do not possess any other human being, no matter how closely related that other may be. No husband owns his wife. No wife owns her husband. No parents own their children. When we think we possess people, there is a tendency to run their lives for them, and out of this develop extremely inharmonious situations. Only when we realize that we do not possess them, that they must live in accordance with their own inner motivations, do we stop trying to run their lives for them, and then we discover that we are able to live in harmony with them. Anything that you strive to hold captive will hold you captive. And if you desire freedom, you must give freedom. Sri Ramakrishna would very similarly say, Kyo karu noi. Nobody belongs to anyone else. Get that out of your head. You have to renounce me and mine. This mamata, this idea that this is my car, my house, my wife, my kid, my this. This is the root of all suffering, actually. Instead, everything is God's. Just imagine, look at that perspective shift. How it makes such a world of difference. The moment we say, no, everything is God. My children, they're actually God's children. God has entrusted me with the responsibility of helping, serving these children to grow in the best possible way. What else do we need to relinquish? All negative feelings. She says, the last kind of relinquishment, the relinquishment of all negative feelings. I want to mention just one negative feeling, she says, which the nicest people still experience. And that negative feeling is worry. So she's thinking of good people, actually. They don't have any hostility, resentment, anger. She says that negative feeling is worry. Worry is not concern, which would motivate you to do everything possible in a situation. So don't be complacent, not that. Worry is a useless mulling over of things we cannot change. This is a kind of disease. That's what clinical anxiety is. It's just you're constantly thinking about something. You're worrying about something. Thinking is not helping it in any way whatsoever. But it prevents you from sleeping properly. It prevents you from having peace of mind and so on. And then she says, now this is also very profound. This is about emotional reactivity. In spiritual life, one of the things that we need to try to overcome, not to become slaves to, is emotional reactivity in the midst of all our circumstances. And this is what she says about it. One final comment about negative feelings, which helped me very much at one time and has helped others. No outward thing, nothing, nobody from without can hurt me inside psychologically. I recognize that I could only be hurt psychologically by my own wrong actions, which I have control over, by my own wrong reactions. Then she says, they are tricky, but I have control over them too. Or by my own inaction in some situations, like the present world situation that need action from me. When I recognized all this, how free I felt, and I just stopped hurting myself. Now someone could do the meanest thing to me, and I would feel deep compassion for this out-of-harmony person, this sick person who is capable of doing mean things. I certainly would not hurt myself by a wrong reaction of bitterness or anger. You have complete control over whether you will be psychologically hurt or not. And anytime you want to, you can stop hurting yourself. So this is also very profound. We have complete control over whether we let other people, circumstances outside of ourselves, to affect us psychologically. And we're free to decide to just water off a duck's back, right? Some of her other teachings, which I'll just mention. She says, Ramakrishna was famous for teaching the harmony of religions. She says exactly the same thing. She says, and you can see resonances with the spiritual but not religious movement. She says, religion is not an end in itself. One's union with God is the ultimate goal. There are so many religions because immature people tend to emphasize trivial differences instead of important likenesses. Differences between faiths lie in creeds and rituals rather than religious principles. How diverse the many paths seem to be at times, but do they not all come together eventually upon the same mountaintop? Are they not all striving for the same thing? We are all God's children and there are no favorites. I really like that. We are all God's children and there are no favorites. God is revealed to all who seek. God speaks to all who will listen. Be still and know God. This should remind you, if you've read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, of his teaching. He says there's a mother who has 5 children. One is a newborn, another is 5 years old, another is 13, another is 21. And she's making this, she has a bunch of fish, and she needs to cook fish for them all. She doesn't make the same fish for everybody. Different fish preparations for her different children. The newborn, obviously, it's not going to be able to eat, something very heavy, so she's not making fish fry. She'll make a fish soup. For the teenager who's hungry and growing boy, fish fry, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that she loves her newborn any less? Then no, that's absurd. She loves them all equally. No favorites, right? Exactly in that way, in the same way Ramakrishna says, God has created different spiritual paths, different religions for different people, of different temperaments, different preferences, different cultures. There's no higher and lower in God's dispensation. We create higher and lower in our own minds. That's that psychological self-harm that she's talking about. And we become fanatics. And there's some amazing passages where it's extraordinary how she reverse engineers Vedanta. She says, lovingly, I informed my well-meaning friends of the existence of 2 widely divergent paths in life and of the free will within all to make their choice. There is a well-worn road which is pleasing to the senses and gratifies worldly desires, but leads to nowhere. And there's a less traveled path which requires purifications and relinquishments, but results in untold spiritual blessings. What does this remind us of for us good Vedanta students? Kathopanishad 1.2.1 says the nerd. Shreyascha preyascha manushyametastav sampariti vivinakti dhiraha. Shreyo hidiro vipreyaso vrinite preyo mando yogakshema vrinite. It's a beautiful mantra, one of my favorites. 2 paths confront every human being. It's like the famous Robert Frost poem as well, right? 2 paths. The 2 paths are what? Perfection and enjoyment. According to this Upanishad, Shreya and Preya. And Peace Pilgrim is saying exactly the same thing in different words. And this Upanishad tells us, wise people choose the path of perfection. The idiots, foolish people, choose the path of enjoyment. And they end up suffering as a result. she says some wonderful things about God. So she says, for instance, God is love. And whenever you reach out in loving kindness, you are expressing God. God is truth. And whenever you seek truth, you are seeking God. God is beauty. And whenever you touch the beauty of a flower or a sunset, you are touching God. God is the intelligence that creates all and sustains all and binds all together and gives life to all. Yes, God is the essence of all. So you are within God and God is within you. You cannot be where God is not. Now you might be thinking, a lot of God, God, God. What about atheists? What about agnostics? What does she say to them? Something wonderful. She says, there's really no such thing as an atheist. For within that person is the divine nature which, when awakened, will feel close to God. There are those who call themselves atheists. For some of them, I've defined God intellectually as the creative force, the sustaining power, the motivation toward change, the overall intelligence, truth. Emotionally, as love, goodness, kindness, beauty. Spiritually, as the ever-present, all-pervading essence or spirit, which binds everything in the universe together and gives life to everything in the universe. Sri Ramakrishna would say, imagine that God is an infinitely powerful magnet. And each of us as souls, the divine soul within us is like a needle. The needle is obviously naturally attracted to the magnet. But then, of course, spiritual aspects will ask, why don't I feel that intense longing for the divine? Ramakrishna says, because there are these layers of mud caked over that needle. Layers of impurity, mental impurity. That's why Peace Pilgrim says we need to purify ourselves. The moment you purify yourself through spiritual practice, remove that mud over that needle, the needle will just fly to the divine, to the God magnet, this divine magnet. Vivekananda was once asked, how can one have bhakti? How can I develop bhakti, devotion for God? What he says is, there is already bhakti within you. There's already devotion within you. Only a veil of lust and greed covers it. And as soon as that is removed, bhakti will manifest by itself. So they're all, Ramakrishna used to say, all jackals howl alike. So the Peace Pilgrim jackal is saying howling exactly in the same way that the Ramakrishna jackal and the Vivekananda jackal and the St. Francis jackal and all these jackals are howling in the same way. Another this is a very philosophically, she was, not like highly educated in any way, but incredibly deep. And she understood very subtle ideas, philosophical ideas, and I want to share with you one of them. This is her explaining the relationship between our individual souls and the divine. And at the same time, in the same breath, she's also reconciling free will and determinism. So what? She says, think of God as a divine ocean and you as one drop with free will. You can choose to remain separate from the ocean, but you won't be happy. You can choose to be a part of the ocean, in which case you will give up your free will, but you will be delightfully happy acting in harmony with God's will. Now you will perceive yourself as a part of God and very much at one with God. So I think this is really wonderful and, again, very resonant with our tradition. Why? Well, because she's saying you start with free will, or let's start with a provisional free will. What do you have the free will to do? You can choose either to be separate from the ocean, this divine ocean, or one with it, because each of us are drops in this divine ocean. There's free will there. There seems to be free will. Once you make the choice to become one with the ocean, what happens? You realize that wasn't even a free choice. That was also the divine working through you, your higher nature, making you merge into the divine ocean. Ramakrishna says, when we realize God, we realize we don't have free will at all. God alone is free. God alone is the doer. But so long as we have not realized the divine, we cannot help but feel that we are free. And it's the divine herself which has implanted in us the illusion of free will. So it's very similar again. Even these subtle teachings on free will and determinism, you find deep resonances between Ramakrishna and Peace Pilgrim here. But she says at the end of the day, Peace Pilgrim says, exactly like Ramakrishna, surrender, surrender, surrender. You're going to finally find that at the culmination of spiritual life is just total surrender. And you have no will of your own. Ramakrishna would liken that to being a baby kitten, which just says, mew, mew. And mother cat will pick it up in its mouth and then plop it wherever it feels like. And all you have to do is surrender and say mew, mew. That's it. Karma and rebirth. Again, didn't study Vedanta, but she just intuitively accepted them. Intuitively. She talks about them very casually. She says, in each being there is a divine nature called by various names. After sufficient lifetimes, so notice, rebirth, it begins to govern the being. That being stands out from the crowd. There have been quite a few. The important thing is that it can govern you. Somebody asked her once, what is karma? And she says, karma is a law of cause and effect. As you sow, so shall you reap. Seen over a span of many lifetimes. Those who get ulcers as a result of hating someone prove to themselves, if they have eyes to see, that the law of karma works. Some of her teachings on prayer, which are really wonderful. She says, the most important part of prayer is what we feel, not what we say. We spend a great deal of time telling God what we think should be done, and not enough time waiting in the stillness for God to tell us what to do. Ramakrishna would call this bhakulata, an intense longing for the divine. That's the highest prayer. That's the deepest prayer. And it's wordless. You don't need words. It's a feeling, and it doesn't come easily. That's the culmination of spiritual practices. Ramakrishna says, once you feel that intense longing, you will know for sure that God realization is not far off. It's that highest state. The highest prayer is just what Aurobindo used to call an inner aspiration for the divine. That's the highest kind of prayer that Peace Pilgrim is also talking about. Physical health. This is something that's important to all of us. She says something very profound here. She says, my life began to be meaningful once she took to the spiritual path. I attained the great blessing of good health. I haven't had an ache or pain, a cold or headache since. And then she adds in parentheses, very casually, she just drops this. She says, most illness, you know, is psychologically induced. And I learned this for myself in training center, that same training center I was at in Belumat during that novitiate period for 2 years. All of us had to go learn puja. And I'd learned puja, but I'm not very good at it. I'm just not good at that stuff. And I was super nervous about doing puja. I was kind of freaking out, stressed out. And suddenly I had this, there's also a yoga class that I did. And in this yoga class, I had a little back injury. And I just became bedridden. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't go to class. I got a leave of absence from class for days. And then one kind brahmachari, who was my senior, because I was the first year and he was the second year, he came to my room with a book in his hand. Some of you probably have read it. How many of you read a book by John Sarno called Healing Back Pain? One person. All right, there we go. A couple people up in the back. All right, good. Healing Back Pain. Fascinating book. And I looked at this brahmachari in astonishment. Dude, I've got a debilitating physical pain. This is an insult. You're giving me a book? This is your... He said, just read it. And he said, this worked for me and I think it'll work for you. And I'm sitting there in the bed, lying down like this, reading this book. And I'm not joking. I read it from cover to cover. The moment I finished, I put it down, back pain gone. I'm not joking. Sarno calls this the knowledge cure. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Literally knowing what it is, what psychological thing that's troubling you or stressing you out or making you feel anxious. Just knowing the source, the emotional or psychological source of the genuine physical symptom. It's not that it's a ghost pain. It was a real back pain. He doesn't deny the physical level symptom or suffering. He says, but the ultimate source is psychological. And the moment you just gain knowledge of what the psychological cause or source of that actual physical pain is, the physical pain will vanish. More or less quickly. Again, you can try it. And for different people, it works. Then I started being a preacher for this book and going around like the Mormons do and read Healing Back Pain. And they're like, no, it doesn't work. Some of them. So for some people, it worked and they just swear by it. They said, you changed my life. And for a lot of people, they're like, it didn't work. So I don't know. It's an individual thing. For me, it was instantaneous. Anyway, so she says exactly the same thing. Maybe I'll read you one story and then I'll wrap it up. So she says about this, because I think it's fascinating. She says, let me tell you a story of a man adversely affected by negative thoughts. He was 65 years old when I knew him, and he was manifesting symptoms of what was called a chronic physical illness. When I talked to him, I realized there was some bitterness in his life. However, I couldn't put my finger on it right away because I saw he was getting along well with his wife, his grown children, and the folks in his community. But the bitterness was there just the same. I found that he was harboring bitterness against his father, who had been dead for many long years, because his father had educated his brother and not him. He was a very intellectual person, so I talked to him at length. When he, the oldest son, was to be educated, his father had absolutely not enough money to do it. In fact, the family was very poor at that time. There were several sisters after him, and I think 3 of them hadn't been educated either. His brother was the youngest, and by that time his father had more money and was able to educate the brother. He didn't begrudge his brother the education. He just thought he should have gotten it too. When he saw intellectually that his father had done the best he could with both of his sons, then he was able to release the bitterness he had been harboring. That so-called chronic illness began to fade away, and soon the condition was much improved, and then it was gone. And then she says, if you're harboring the slightest bitterness toward anyone or any unkind thoughts of any sort whatever, you must get rid of them quickly. They're not hurting anyone but you. It isn't enough just to do right things and say right things. You must also think right things before your life can come into harmony. And 2 more things. I know it's 12, but I'll say 2 more things. First, we're often given, I think rightly, a hard time, us as monks in this tradition, for sometimes kind of like making householders feel like they're second-class citizens in spiritual life. And that's certainly not, I never try to do that, but I might come off that way sometimes. And because Peace Pilgrim herself was such an extraordinary renunciate in so many ways, as we know, some people felt intimidated who are householders. And this is one of these intimidated householders. She asks her a question. How does an ordinary housewife and mother find what you seem to possess? And she gives a wonderful answer. She says, one who is in the family pattern, as most people are, finds inner peace in the same way that I found it. And remember, she was a great renunciate. Obey God's laws, which are the same for all of us. Not only the physical laws, but also the spiritual laws which govern human conduct. You might start by living all the good things you believe, as I did. Find and fit into your special place in the divine plan, which is unique for every human soul. That's that life pattern that she's talking about. You might try seeking and receptive silence, as I did. Being in the family pattern is not a block to spiritual growth, and in some ways, it is an advantage. Ramakrishna says, being a householder can be like fighting from a fort, like you have a certain fortification and protection. She says something similar. She says, we grow through problem solving, and being in the family pattern provides plenty of problems to grow on. When people enter the family pattern, they often have their first outgoingness from self-centeredness into family-centeredness. Pure love is a willingness to give without a thought of receiving anything in return. And the family pattern provides the first experience of pure love, a mother's and father's love for their baby. So if you just change your attitude toward your own family life, you can make it spiritual. Everything, you're raising your children, your relationship with your spouse, your partner, and so on, the work you're doing, all of those things are just different opportunities for spiritual practice and spiritual growth. So what did Peace Pilgrim embody? What did she stand for? Simple things, unglamorous things, simplicity, purity, devotion, surrender, and service. This is one of the keynotes, service, 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 serving others. Those are the qualities, those inner qualities that made her great. I think one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. And I wanted to close with a devotional meditation that she herself practiced and recommended. And I'm just going to read you and close the talk with her own words. And I encourage you to close your eyes. Know that you are God's beautiful child, always in God's hands. Accept God. Accept God's protection. There is really no problem to fear. Know that you are not the clay garment. Know that you are not the self-centered nature which governs your life needlessly. Know that you are the God-centered nature, the kingdom of God within, the indwelling Christ, eternal and indestructible. Identify with the real you. Peace, be still, and know that I am God. Peace, be still and know that I am. Peace, be still and know. Peace, be still. Peace, be. Peace, peace, peace. And now, with the knowledge that we are God's perfect children, eternal and indestructible, let us go our separate ways in love, but always remain together in spirit. Thank you.